Why Not Freedom was followed right after, I guess, what, about 3 years after the South was right. But, and again, we looked at the original intentions of the Founding Fathers. We saw some actual examples of how the federal government violates constitutional rights of we the people. And for the first time, we actually put down in writing a constitutional amendment that would guarantee, acknowledge the right of nullification, to give we the people the right to control the federal government. Subsequent to that, we did was Jefferson Davis right, and that we had a lot of people say, well, wait a minute, y'all are talking about secession. Secession is treason. And I said, wait, secession isn't treason. You know, it's treason, I guess, if you are a secessionist and the empire defeats you, they can brand you anything. So this was a defense of President Davis, but also all of Southerners against the charge that secession in 1861 was treason. And we actually go through and explain and demonstrate how Jefferson Davis was a great American patriot who used all of his efforts and energy to the time until that he was elected to the U.S. Congress, to the time that he left, to maintain the constitutional union. He was a great patriot, a great American. He loved the country, and he wanted to keep the Union together.
Interesting thing on was Jefferson Davis, right, was the whole time after the defeat of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis pleaded with his captors to try me, put me on trial. He wanted a public trial because he felt like then he could put everything in public record, why the South fought, and make the North explain why the federal government invaded sovereign states. The federal government never gave him a trial, and they did not because they knew that that would give him a legitimacy because he could prove that he was correct. And what Ron and I have done in Was Jefferson Davis Right was try to act as his defenders in a trial in a public setting of Jefferson Davis. I wrote that book. Ron looked over my shoulder to make sure I was getting it right, of course. But in that book, what we're looking at is the mythology all around the issue of slavery and race in America. One of the things that Ron and I have always believed in is liberty. And one of our patron saints of the Founding Fathers is St. George Tucker, who was a Virginian, who was an early member of the Constitutional Convention that gave us our Constitution. He was a colonel in the Virginia militia during the War for American Independence. So he was a great American patriot. But he defined slavery in three manners. It was chattel slavery, which is a man owning a man, civil slavery, which government denies you your civil liberties, and political slavery, when one nation enslaves another nation. He was opposed to all three. Matter of fact, he was the first and probably the only founding father of this nation who spoke out against what we would later become known as laws that discriminate against people of color. So he was light years ahead of the civil rights movement, and he was a Southerner. And this is the guy that Ron and I really pattern ourselves by because he was so thoughtful of the future and of civil liberties. And in Myths of American Slavery, we show how this issue of slavery has been misused to divide Americans, and instead we're trying to get the truth out that would unite us together.
Reclaiming Liberty is a book that I worked on and published, and Donald looked over my shoulder and told me where I was doing things wrong. But Reclaiming Liberty, really, it starts off by looking at the law, because you say reclaiming liberty, obviously liberty has been lost. So how can we regain it? And I look back at the last century is a century of conservative failure. And this is the thing that's important for the Tea Party people to understand, for the Town Hall people to understand, for the 10th Amendment people to understand, is that for the last 100 years, conservatives have lost. We've lost time and time and time again because the structure of the federal government is a structure of empire. And nothing that we do on the periphery makes any difference as long as we leave that superstructure in place. For instance, when the FDR passed the Social Security Act, man, conservatives railed against it. It was socialism, and it was socialism. Now, it wasn't communist Marxist socialism. It was more of a Bismarckian Prussian socialism, much like National Socialism or Mussolini's socialism. But the conservatives railed against it and said, we can't have this. And so when the conservatives gained control of Congress in 1952, do you think the conservatives rolled back any of that socialist legislation? Of course not. So you come forward to the Nixon era, you know, right after LBJ's Great Society and more socialism forced upon American people. Nixon did he roll back in? Not a bit. Matter of fact, he added things that even Lyndon Johnson couldn't get through Congress. Well, along come Ronald Reagan. I'm talking, what did he do domestically to roll back big government? All he was able, it wasn't his fault, but all he was able to do was to slow down the rate of government. The federal government didn't grow quite as fast. The point is, it's not that we don't have the right people elected. You know, it's hard enough to elect the right people, but the system itself will not allow you to control it. The system is designed to maintain itself and to maintain the perks, privileges, and power of a centralized federal government. That's why in Reclaiming Liberty, I then went to great lengths to point out the need for the constitutional amendment to allow for nullification, acknowledge the right of nullification, and to return that power, put the power in the hands of the people. Not congressmen, not the federal Supreme Court, not the federal chief executive, the president. Because notice, all that says federal. Well, you're asking the federal government to discipline itself. The federal government is a tyrant. It will not discipline itself. So that's what I was doing in Reclaiming Liberty, point out that conservative failure, if we maintain that same system of doing the same things we always did, elect good men, elect good women, send them to Washington, and see how long it takes for them to become not so good. The system is set up to pervert power and to localize it, centralize it in Washington, D.C. What we're talking about in Reclaiming Liberty is to find a way that we can reclaim liberty, and that's only by bringing the right to we the people of the sovereign state to be the final arbiter of what is and is not the constitutional prerogative of the federal government.
I think an interesting thing in Reclaiming Liberty, in the intro we talk about, or Ron talks about, the possibility of big government being dead. What was the famous Clinton quote? The era of big government is over. And everybody thought, oh man, the good conservatives are controlling both houses of Congress, the era of big government's over. So many people told Ron at that time, you don't need that book anymore because the era of big government is over. Ron said emphatically, just like we point out in Nullifying Tyranny, that no, Washington is the problem. Until we can circumvent the power elite that controls Washington, D.C., until we can put it in the hands of the people in the sovereign states, Washington will always grow, and our liberty will continue to shrink and shrink.
Okay, and finally, could you just tell us what it was like being on Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher? Was that fun?
Actually, I would have to say that Bill Maher, off camera, was a gracious individual. On camera, it was a lot of fun to beat him up, and I enjoyed that. I was on his program 3 times, and as I said, he made some snide remarks. He was cutting, biting, just typical Bill Maher, and I think that we dealt with him appropriately, and I enjoyed it. And as I said, once we got off camera, he was just very courteous and very nice, and he appeared to generally enjoy having our input. What he's looking for when he invited Ron and myself out on his show, obviously, is to have someone to be a focal point of controversy. He got what he wanted, and I enjoyed giving it to him.